folks, and welcome back to the Totally Tanked podcast. It is episode 24. It is the 6th of November, 2021. My name is John, and I am joined in the pod by...
Rob. Hello, folks. Welcome
Hello,
to Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in tankdom.
Now, let's just, first up, the tank this episode is the IS2. And we're
Death of Stalin.
So the J in Joseph can also be written as I, so that's why it's either the JS2 or the IS2, depending on which transliteration you're relying on. It's the same tank, and it is both named after Joseph Stalin. Just a little bit of housekeeping first while we've got you all here at the start. There are many hundreds of you who will listen to this podcast in the first week it's put out, and only maybe 5 or 6 of you have left a review, and the other, 495 odd of you should all feel very bad, and we want you to just jump on your app that you listen to the podcast on and give us a review. And the other thing I would note is fantastic, so many of you are obviously subscribed to the podcast. There is actually a Facebook page. If you just search for Totally Tanked, it'll come up. And we do post some stuff about upcoming episodes and stats and
give you the chance to tell us what beer to drink.
Yeah, you can make suggestions to Rob on the beer front. He won't listen to you, but
I'm an independent thinker.
Yeah, or you can criticise Rob's beer choices, which is a very popular pastime. Okay,
doesn't matter to me. The beer still gets drunk.
Yes. And thank you for those who said that our beer reviews are a work of genius. That's the sort of comment you can leave if you leave a review for this podcast. And of course, Rob, what is the correct number of stars for any review?
5?
5. 5 is the
7?
only correct number. No, they only let you do 5. But if you could do 7, that's what you should do. So, we are talking the IS-2.
Yes, the Russian heavy tank came after the KV series and... brought out in 43, 46 tons of Russian strong...
43 or 44?
46 of... what year it came out? Or,
yeah.
Yes, no, it came out in 43, December 43.
Okay, yep.
Didn't actually see surface until January 44, but yeah. Look, it's I'll start off saying it's a damn good tank. And what's the most... impressive thing about this tank, John?
122mm gun in World War II.
122mm gun. This is a naval gun. They said, and they were looking at the Russians had captured a couple of target ones at the beginning of 43 and said to themselves, okay, we're needing a new heavy tank because we're seeing these tiger things wandering around the battlefield. So we're building some, trying out some guns. And they found their latest gun, the 85, which they were mounting on the T-34-85 at this stage.
The 85 was an excellent anti-tank gun as well.
But it wasn't doing the job. So they said, right, well, what can we go bigger? Okay, we can go this 100mm gun. But
why stop at 100?
Yeah, why stop the D10? Why stop at that? And then they said, you know what? We do have these 122 naval guns just lying around that we can just throw on there. And that's what they did.
With, it should be noticed, one of the most significant muzzle brakes I think I've ever seen on any tank. It's a very big multi-part muzzle brake. The
first Russian tank with the muzzle brake, surprisingly enough.
Yeah, right, okay.
Because, guess what? If you fire one of these things inside, it's going to blow the back of your turret out.
Yeah, just lift the turret off the ring and move it somewhere else.
If you don't have a turret... And they had to go through a number of trials of finding the right muzzle brake, including almost killing one of their marshals who was inside the thing as it was firing, and they were trying out one of the muzzle brakes, and it slammed him so hard inside the turret that they almost killed him. They said, no, we need a better muzzle brake than that.
That's not a view we often get of Russian marshals actually being inside the tank for a test firing. So, I mean, it's worth noting, we were talking about this off mic, that almost everything we in the West think we know about World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front, was written mostly by rehabilitated German generals trying to defend their own reputation. And then that was supported by the Western powers because they wanted the Russians to be the big bad enemy.
Yeah, the next bogeyman in the Cold War.
So all this stuff about Russians being unsophisticated, relying on human wave tactics, which I'm not saying the Russians never used human wave tactics, but often there was human waves being supported by massed artillery and enormous numbers of heavy heavy tanks and all the things we view as sophisticated warfare. So the Russians are, even today, I mean, literally in the last fortnight in this town, there was a radio host trying to say that all Russians, everything they build is dodgy crap, were his words. Which, I mean, it's just fundamentally racism. The fact that they've got light skin doesn't mean it's not racism to say that all Russian things are dodgy crap. And frankly, it's not like Australia's ever put a satellite in orbit either. We have paid for our satellites to be put up other people's rockets, but we haven't built our own rockets.
Our Space Force is going to get there one day, John. Don't you worry, Space Force.
Yeah,
what are we calling it? Arse?
No, that's a joke, but it's a very good joke. Australian research and space exploration. Yeah, arse. Getting back to the IS. So the Russian heavy tank series at the start of the war, of course, was the KVs. We've done the KV-1 and a little bit of stuff we talked about.
Named after Clement Voroshilov. And of course, he's fallen out of favour by this stage of the war, and they're saying, okay, we need to rename this new heavy tank. And who we're going to name it after? The Man of Steel himself.
I think they were when they named it after Clement, it was partly because they weren't sure if it was going to work out. And you don't want to put Joseph Stalin's name on a dud.
No.
That's
a
bad idea.
And let's face it, the IS, they must have been feeling pretty good about the IS, that the fact that they actually did name it that. I mean, they started out as Object 237 or whatever it was.
Yeah, which is how the Russians designed tanks, yeah.
Yeah, until it was actually said, you know what, we think we've got something good here, guys. Let's put the big man's name on it and go from there. And with that... there was a whole series of Joseph Stalin tanks, IS tanks, after the war. But the last one came out in the early 50s, and it was going to be the Joseph Stalin 8 or 9 or something, or D10, but they ended up changing it to the T10? D10?
Yep.
Sorry, I've forgotten.
No, the T10.
T10, because Stalin had died, and everybody was saying, well, you know what, those last 40 years that he's been in power, or 30 years that he's been in power, weren't that great, so we might leave his legacy behind for a little bit. So that's why they changed the name of the series at that point.
Have you watched the movie, The Death of Stalin?
Not yet, but it is on my list.
Yeah. Now's not a bad time for us to quickly mention. Russians hate it because it compacts a lot of complex history into a 2-hour movie and takes some liberties. It's written by Arnaldo Iannucci, who wrote The Thick of It and Veep. So in terms of political machinations, it's wonderful. And the depiction of Georgy Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov, and his...
wandering around the Kremlin with the AK-47 shooting people.
Not quite that, but he sort of twirls around, clattering his medals at one stage to make a point. And it's funny because they've got a guy who's about 1,000,000 times more handsome than the actual Zhukov to play him, and the depiction makes him look like an absolute badass legend, which, Marshal Zhukov was in many ways. But his family absolutely hate the depiction, and there's a reason the movie's banned in Russia is partly just because the Zhukov family don't like the depiction, which is a shame because I think it is actually getting to a positive view of the essence of the man. But anyway.
Let's go back to our tank. Anyway.
Yes. So, and now, what's the power plant, Rob?
It's the diesel 600 horsepower V...
The Kharkov V2?
Yeah, the Kharkov V2. The one that they shove in everything. And you know what? It works. Mm-hmm. Why is that, John? Because it's only 46 tonnes.
The tank,
The tank. So, just to put that in perspective, the Panthers, which were around at this stage, are the same weight at 45, 47. Mm-hmm. The Tiger 1 is 55, 57.
Yep.
And the Tiger 2, which is also just coming into service, is at 65. So 20 tonnes heavier. And yet similar capabilities now.
And most importantly, the armour on the IS2 was not...
It was cast. It was the big thing.
Yeah, but it wasn't invulnerable. But what it was it could take quite comfortably a hit from one of the Big Cat's 88s at 1,000 yards, which was the German standard engagement range, and not be penetrated on the frontal hit by this, what was a tank-shattering gun against anything else.
Yeah.
So the frontal armour was fantastic. They did something very clever that in the T-34s in particular, the sloped armour all around really reduced the internal volume of the tank. And in the IS-2, they said, you know what? we'll just slope the armour at the front and not slope the side. There is a bit of sloping on the sides, but the armour isn't as sloped.
20 degrees on the side.
So yes, if it gets hit on the side, it's in trouble. Any tank gets hit on the side.
One of the big innovation that the Russians had that the Germans didn't is that they could cast the hulls and all the armour. So what that meant for them is that they were able to change the thickness of the armour in one piece, and so where it could be 90 mils on the side, on the hull side at one point, it could be 130 mils at another point on the hull side, and that's still all one piece. There's no welds, there's no gaps, there's no rivets or anything like that. It's just one piece, and that because they could actually gradiate the thickness, it still maintained all its strength, but it saves so much weight that they'll be able to say, okay, all the most damage on tanks is coming in from their front 90 degrees, therefore that's the part we're going to armour heavily, and then you can save so much weight and space by having these round, and they could also round and shape the armour how they wanted to, so they didn't have to have flat planes, they could have rounded turrets and all sorts of other bits of armour.
Which did actually deflect incoming rounds well. It's worth noting that everything you're talking about can be said about medieval plate harness that men-at-arms, wore in the medieval period. A plate cuirass or chest plate will have wildly varying thicknesses throughout, with the thickest bits being at the places you're most likely to get tonked with a poleaxe, and the thinner stuff for where you're just worried about arrows and swords and the like. And that's... So the concepts of this armour making were hardly new or novel, but they were applying it to their tanks
on an industrial scale as well. Whereas with your armour analogy there, you've still got one person who's working for a year to make that armour, right? And making all those various thicknesses. Whereas these things are being rolled out day in, day out by the Russian factories of just getting casting the hull, casting the armour, and rolling it out and applying it and whacking it on the tank.
There is something wonderful about the rough-hewn nature of the IS2s. The ones that are still in museums,
they're just not. They're not pretty. They're not polished or pretty or anything like that.
I'd say they're pretty, but they're not polished.
No, but it's just you can see that this is just a big chunk of metal that's been cast and left like that. There is no finishing touches on it. Yeah. It's obviously they're saying, "Yep, we don't care what these things look like. We're going to do it, roll them out, and get them going," which is what the Russians were having to do by that stage.
Yeah. And, I mean, let's talk... The 122mm gun had a very slow rate of fire.
Well, so a lot of different information about it was two-part ammunition, because one, it's a naval gun, and two, if you actually had a single round...
Couldn't load it.
It was too long. It was going to be too long to be able to... And not only that, you'd have the poor bloody loader is lifting up 25 kilos for each part. And so you're trying to hoist that thing in quickly. You're not going to do it, and there's just no room. So they had to... If you're going to have the gun that size, you have to have the two-part ammo.
Yeah, I think the record for tanks is three-part ammunition. And obviously for naval guns, I think they could go up to 8 or 9 powder bags.
Yeah, how many powder bags you can put in there type thing. But so you had this two-part ammunition, and yet you were only getting out 2 rounds a minute. And they did improve that with the drop breech improvement that came around in 44. That allowed them to get up to 3 rounds a minute on a good day.
Yeah,
strong loader.
Around every 22nd if you're on parade and the field marshal's watching, but probably less when the enemy's shooting at you, that speeds you up a bit. But the point is that as the post-war tank research showed, acquiring the target first, shooting accurately first, was what determined the outcome of tank combat. And if you've got one in the breech ready to go, then you are not at as big a disadvantage as you might think. And the Panther could in theory fire 6 rounds a minute, but if it's being blown out of existence by your first round, then it doesn't really matter how many more it can fire. And with the 122mm cannon, it was bending the turret rings of German big tanks when it hit them, even if it didn't penetrate. And once your turret ring is bent, your turret is not turning, and that's pretty much game over for that tank. It was also creating spalling because it was just such a big blast that when it hit, that the inside of the German armour was shattering and wiping out the crew.
Yeah, the other important point here is that at this stage of the war, from 44 onwards, the Germans didn't have enough manganese, so they were using a very high carbon steel on the tanks, and so that would create a lot more spalling, whereas the manganese armour did not. So it was much less brittle. So the Russians went through a few phases with the looking at the gun. So we said before, they started out looking at the 85mm cannon to put in the tank. They did try out a 100mm gun and they said, okay, this will be a higher velocity and it can fit on easily. But what they found was there was a couple of reasons why they said we're going to go with the 122, which does seem like a ludicrous gun to be throwing on top of it onto a tank.
I mean, for reference, for those who don't follow these things that closely, although you listen to this podcast, the biggest modern tank gun is 125 mils. That's in mainstream use.
Yep.
And even American tanks this day are only 120 mils. Although 130 is definitely coming for Western tank designs. And the Russians have been on 125 for a while. So this World War II tank had a gun that, at least in terms of the width of the shell it was firing, was equivalent to a modern tank.
Wasn't as fast as the modern tanks, but anyway. So they tried out this 100mm gun on the tank, and they found a few issues with it. One, they didn't have as many supplies for it, so it was an anti-aircraft gun, and there wasn't as many of them around. They didn't have the ammo for it, and they said, what we do have? We do have these naval guns, these A-19 naval guns, that we have plenty of those in production, and that's why they chose to mount them on. But the 100mm round, while it was faster and had just as good penetration, it was a single piece of ammunition.
So it's actually heavier for the load of the
It was actually heavier, and it still didn't fit. It was still long enough that it was actually just a slower firing rate inside the turret. So I found that, for the outcomes, it's got a lot of drawbacks, even though it would be the normal progression of your upgunning your tanks from the 85 to 100. That would be your normal step. But by skipping that and going straight to the 122, they've gained a lot of benefits, and while at the same time only keeping the same detriments. So it's a win overall.
Yeah. Now, let's a little bit of context here. Gun bore width, which is what we're describing with these numbers, is a very rough measure. And in one particular case, the move from the 75 to the 76 for Western tanks in World War II, it sounds like a 1mm change in diameter, but it was basically twice the size of the shell.
Yeah,
now,
much longer.
Not every time you make a 1mm move does it change it that dramatically, but it does indicate that going from 85 to 100 is a huge upstep in a gun, and from going from that to 122 is also, it's not just 22mm difference, it is a really big difference in the size of the shell fire. And in a way, I guess they were lucky in that the Germans were going to more brittle armour just as they happened to field a gun that really made brittle armour miserable. So there's always a trade-off with brittleness and hardness, and a higher carbon steel can be very good at keeping out lots of things, but when it's overmatched, it fails in spectacularly bad ways.
Yep, and look, another detriment for the 122 was, because they were such large rounds, you could only fit 28 in the turret. So you only had 28 rounds to fire. And just to show what this tank was built for, it wasn't just a tank-on-tank design, built for tank-on-tank engagements, which is what the Tiger was built for, which had about 80 rounds of AP.
I mean, the Tiger was initially built as a breakthrough tank, so enemy fortifications were part of the original design, but it wasn't how it was used, I grant you.
Yeah. Whereas the IS2 had 20 rounds of HE and only 8 rounds of AP in the turret. So
that's high explosive and armour piercing.
Yeah, so it's not designed for just take-on tanks. It was, as we keep saying, it was a breakthrough tank. It was to hit enemy positions, whether they're bunkers or artillery in the open or any sort of thing, is getting through, breaking through the lines and then throwing around a shitload of HE to disrupt the enemy and allow the T-34-85s to suddenly race through and exploit the rear areas.
I mean, one of the things that for me is this is one of the most recognisable tanks ever made. Once you start looking at it, because it's reasonably obscure. I did love that one of our fans on Twitter described us as a podcast talking about obscure tanks, and my first reaction was, with the exception of the Italian tanks and the S-tank maybe, everything else we've talked about has been some of the most produced tanks ever. But then I realised that if you're an American, and the M1 has just been the only tank for 3 generations now, so anything that's not that is an obscure tank, and that's fine. But so the IS2...
it stands out just because of that huge barrel.
That huge gun with the huge muzzle brake makes it quite clear. What are you looking at? Is the gun is bigger than anything you've ever seen. Yeah. It's an IS2. It also, the way it has external fuel tanks around 3 sides is quite distinctive. And big wide tracks, and
the tracks weren't that wide. It was a much narrower tank than... So while it was similar in size to the German Big Cats, it was much narrower, and I think that actually... whether or not that was designed because of the railway sizes, I don't know, but to my mind, it makes whereas the Germans had to pull off the sides of everything and muck around and doing all that sort of stuff to get through certain tunnels with the Big Cats... It's the IS is about 30 centimetres narrower, so they wouldn't have had to stuff around with all those sort of things if they had the same rail gauges and rail cars. So
yep, I still think. I mean, just to look at it, you don't look at those tracks and say those are skinny tracks. They're not as big as some others, but they're pretty wide.
Yeah. It was. I mean, but the overall size of the width of the hull, and even though it was similar height and length to the German tanks of the equivalent German tanks, so. But it wasn't quite as wide. And I think that must have been. I think that must have been a reason. I don't know.
They did an astonishing job in designing this tank. 45 tons. For a heavily armoured tank with the biggest gun known to tank warfare at the time, and that would stay the biggest.
There were 152s wandering around as the assault guns and so forth.
Sure, but you're really talking about self-propelled artillery at that level. But just as a tank, to get armour that the Germans couldn't get through with their big 88s, a gun that overmatched them, and still down at 45 tons with a 500 horsepower engine. There
was the equivalent speed of the Tigers. The Tigers and Tiger 2s could go... the Tigers go slightly faster just because they had another higher gear on the tank. But
as long as the final drive didn't break.
Yeah, that's exactly right. For all the German engineering, is a case of if you went too fast for too long, things started breaking inside of them. Whereas the Russians, they could go slower for a lot longer. So now, and they had decent reliability for these things. And
we have talked in the past about the engine. I'm just going to talk about it again because Konstantin Chelpan was murdered in 1938 by the Russians, by the Soviets as a traitor, and they did apologise for doing that and admitted they were wrong in the 1950s. Which this whole rehabilitation of people's reputation is. It's bad that they've killed people for no good reason. At least they admitted they were wrong. And I don't think we've got an equivalent in Western countries of admitting that people we've killed as traitors weren't actually traitors. There are posthumous pardons, I guess. But anyway.
Dreyfus affair, maybe?
Yeah, we didn't really apologise to him, did we?
Probably not.
Anyway, so Konstantin Chelpan in 1938 made this engine. It's an aluminium block diesel engine, V12. It's often called the KV2 because it's from the Kharkov factory and it's version 2, but it's not related to the KV2 tank directly, although that tank did use that engine to complicate things. Because they all did. And basically the Russian T-90s are still running on a modified version of this same engine that this one dude came up with in 1938, who was then tortured and executed, which is quite the irony that this astonishing gift... And it's worth noting, for equivalency, the most powerful tank engine the Americans used in the entire Second World War only got up to 450 horsepower. And then that was using aircraft engines in their tanks, and that's kind of trying to get the scale of achievement that the Russians had with this engine in 38 that is essentially continued in the service in the modern day. Anyway, and it certainly helped them build a 45-ton heavy tank with a 122mm gun.
Well, the weight issue was, I think, down to the armour, but they also had putting the drivetrain or the transmission. Let me just find them. The rear-mounted transmission allowed a much smaller hull because there was no need for the drive shaft below the hull. So again, keeping things narrow and compact by saying, yep, we're not going to have a front drive. We're going to put everything happening in the rear.
It's the most sensible thing to do with the tank. It's astonishing it took so long for them to realise that putting the drive sprocket next to the engine is really helpful.
With having such a heavy gun and a lot of armour forward rather than rear, does make it a little bit nose heavy. And with the lack of gun depression and elevation, that was it only had 3 degrees gun depression and 18 degrees gun elevation, which isn't too bad. But having such a big gun,
I haven't seen inside the turret, but when you've got a breach that big, it's not going to move much.
No. So the point being is that this is a tank for fighting in cities and on the plains of the steppes of Russia. You do not want to take it anywhere with any sort of slope or hill or anything like that.
Well, cities would get a bit tricky in that you can't elevate to deal with things at the higher floors. On the other hand, with the gun this big, you can just level the building.
Exactly. So, that's exactly what they did to Berlin. So we'll get to that. But even in cities, they had issues that if they took one's track up on a gutter, it would throw out the ability to aim the gun just because of that slight change in elevation. So it was a difficult thing. It was they couldn't if they had to be on pretty much flat ground. Otherwise, certainly there was a lot of area that they could not cover with the gun. So,
but when you're building a tank to drive the Germans off the Russian steppe and back into Prussia,
which is what they did,
it's just fine.
It worked just fine for that. All right, so there were 3,800 of these made. All during the war. Production stopped at the end of the war, and they moved on to the IS-3. But the IS-2s were upgraded and used for quite a long time and provided to a lot of different countries of the Eastern Bloc or different areas.
And I think it's worth... For the Russians, this was really obsolete by the end of the war, but they just had a bunch of them and a bunch of people they wanted to sell tanks to.
Well, they didn't really sell them because soon after this, you had the
T-52.
Yeah, you really was giving them to areas where they wanted to basically provide them some heavy armour, because soon after this you had the T-55s coming out, and that's the one they sold to everybody. Right? Yeah. So that's why we've only got 3,800 of these in made, but they were given out to China when they were still friends, to Cuba in 1960, to East Germany. The Czechs got some, Hungary got some, Poland and Romania got a couple. But surprisingly enough, every time that these areas had their own little counter-revolutions in the 50s and 60s, the Russians would turn around and say, those tanks we gave you, we want those back so that you can't use them to kick us out of your state. So,
you've got an issue that these are they're breakthrough tanks, limited situations. You want that. B, they're a tank very much designed for the heavy tank battalions in the tank guard armies. And we have mentioned before that if you have to be assigned to any unit of a military in history, being in a guards tank army is one of the better places to be.
Like the Praetorian Guard, basically you get better pay, you get better conditions, and it's usually more of you.
Yeah, and you're only used when there's overwhelming force available. So there's a lot to be said for.
You usually don't have jobs of having to stand around and do garrison duty.
Rob, language. What'll happen to our clean rating?
All right, other countries I didn't mention before was North Korea got some. Not really saying how many, but they...
That is a very contentious point, I believe.
Yep, and supposedly the Vietnamese or Viet Minh got given some from China during when fighting against the French, but we'll get onto that later on when we talk about them in action. So there was a few of them floating around before the T-55s really came into their own on the international market.
Look, the Russians never dispose of a tank. it's not what they do. They keep them around. I mean, I can remember riding the Trans-Siberian Railway up to the Chinese border in the 90s, and there were T-55s hull down in
there could have been IS2s hull down in those positions.
I'm pretty sure I was looking at T-55s because of that very distinctive dome turret, but there could well have been. My point is the Russians don't get rid of tanks; they keep them around.
The Chinese took theirs, and they've cemented those into the border there as well. So they're facing into Russia.
Not visible from the rail line because I was watching closely.
Quite possibly not.
Yeah.
But look, so it entered service in 1943. You know, it was still used up until 1995.
Who was using that?
South Ossetia. For those who don't know, South Ossetia is a
breakaway part of Georgia.
Yes.
Yep.
And they had basically they'd broken away from Georgia, and they had a bit of a war with the Russians. Supported by the Russians against Georgia in 2008. So
some would say the NATO egged on the Georgian leadership to start that war, and then didn't like it when the Russians came in hot. We're talking a very complicated part of the world.
Yeah, but the Russians still had them themselves up until that point, and actually finally got rid of them all. So they were actually active service until the 70s by the Russians.
But again, you've got the legacy of Konstantin Chelpan once again, in that because every single tank is using basically the same engine, it's not that hard to keep them all running. You know, it's the same spare parts train.
Yep.
You know, and if the engine runs, the tank will run.
So the Russians had them, and they were in service through up through the 70s, and then they basically mothballed them there. But they finally got rid of all theirs in 95 as well. So again, it had longevity. I was they're floating around. What the Cubans are doing with theirs, or nobody's really mentioned, but. Or the North Koreans.
Maybe we should make an offer.
Yeah. All right, things we haven't mentioned. It could ford rivers. It wasn't a floater. It was going through at shallow spots.
There is definitely video and quite a lot of it of IS2s fording what looked like reasonably deep water, like it was coming up to the turret ring. I mean, someone was. I was going to say shouting at us, but politely emailing us that apparently the Russian doctrine with the snorkeling tanks was more about using them at cleared crossing points instead of so that the bridge can be used for trucks and things, and that the tanks will be fording the river in a planned and scouted stream next to the bridge.
Bridges being natural choke points and slows everything down unless you've got some good MPs directing traffic.
Even then, there's a limit to what they can do. And if you can create a second stream that has been cleared, and you know that if they keep the engine running and keep going, they'll get up the other side. There is some value to that. So I can't remember which listener told me about that, but thank you. Good to know.
All right, so they've got a crew of 4, loader, gunner, driver and commander.
Perfect. Finally a tank with the right crew.
The commander didn't have to fire the gun this one. It's just they didn't have a radio operator.
But this is, it is archetypally a guard's tank. This is the good stuff for the good units to use when things really matter. And it's a bit funny in that we have all these assumptions about communism, but the internal competition they actually had between groupings and units with different pay levels and design bureaus building different vehicles. It's really interesting how a lot of our assumptions about communism are really not great. Soviet communism, sorry.
So besides the 122 cannon, they also had 2 MGs. Again, as per the KV series, they had the rear
Dalek one at the back.
They had the little Dalek gun at the back to take on any infantry that might try and climb over the rear of the tank. So it was faced rearwards, and also another.
I am somewhat surprised they held on to that, given that no one else has really gone that way. I mean, the Japanese did with the Hago, it's true.
But it was obviously that was the threat. They saw that as a threat. So
I guess what surprises me is, no tank is meant to operate in isolation.
No.
So the idea has always been that, if there are infantry climbing on the engine deck of another tank in your platoon, then you hose that down with your machine gun.
I guess they might have been building it as because they were breaking through, that there would be infantry around them as they were breaking through the lines, and so they had to fend off that threat.
Yeah,
yeah, that's where realistically you've broken through the enemy strong points. You cleared a channel for your T-34-85s to start racing through to exploit, and you're there holding it against any counterattacks, which may include against any infantry that is bunkered down while you're assaulting, and then suddenly you've got to hold them off as they join in the counterattack from any enemies coming towards you.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a bad day at the office for infantry that are reduced to trying to climb onto the deck of the enemy tank to assault it, and it's a bad day to be in that tank, but, war is hell, and this isn't the worst thing that happens to anyone.
Anyway, so there was another DT gun in the hull, in the turret, coax gun in there, and later versions had a heavy MG placed on a cupola on the outside so that they could carry out anti-aircraft fire. So that was anyway, they had it. They had a nice big gun out there. Other things, they didn't have much. They only had 250 rounds for the heavy machine gun on the cupola though. So that would not be a lot of fire.
No, again, it was not a tank designed for sustained action. That really wasn't the point of it. It was to get up there, fire that enormous gun at something important, and withdraw to reload at leisure. Now,
other parts that go with it is the doctrine. So we've said before, it was a heavy breakthrough tank. It was deployed in guard battalions as a breakthrough tank, which meant there were small independent units. They would be under their high command and focused on important points of...
So when you say small units, though, a guard tank brigade had 3 regiments of 65 IS2s each.
Yeah, but... okay, so... The heavy tank regiments were only 21 tanks. To put that in perspective, on the German side, the heavy tank battalions were 45 targets. So, and usually say a battalion is half of a regiment.
Yep.
Right? And you have 3 regiments to a brigade. Is the traditional thinking.
Russians did it differently, I think.
They did. But they had small units. 21 tanks in your... and then again, you could split up your regiment into 2 battalions of... one would be 11, one would be 10. And go from there. So that's how they would split them up. So again, they would have smaller formations, but then they would feed into 65 tanks in the brigade, and then they'd run around as a heavy tank brigade of 3 regiments and do that. But they were still deployed as tank regiments. So 21 running around, and even that could be, as I said, could be split up into battalions. But because they were independent units, so they weren't beholden to an infantry army group or anything like that. They were basically told, okay, you are available to whatever activity was going on. You're not dedicated to a front or a army group or anything else. We're going to deploy you where we need you as required. So again, we're going through a breakthrough here in Belarus. Bang, I'm going to dump a brigade, a couple of heavy tank brigades into that spot there, and away you go, start charging through. And so again, that doctrinal aspect of it shows the intent of how these things were used. They weren't embedded within units. They weren't providing the anti-tank fire for a unit. So they were just only there to carry out breakthrough activities. Now, one of the things I liked about the IS-2 was the German reaction to it. So the way the Russians reacted to the Germans and the way the Germans reacted to the Russians is very complicated and shows a lot of critical thinking on both sides of what they were doing. So first off, the Russians capture some Tigers and they...
Well, particularly the Battle of Kursk, the Russians said, we're going to need a bigger gun.
Yeah, and so they said they put on the bigger gun. And then later on, the Germans have captured an IS-2, and their tank generals have come along and said, these things are pretty good. We need to be careful here because the Russians are churning out lots and lots and lots of these tanks as well as the T-34-85s, and we've only got a very limited number of Tigers, Tiger 2s, and Panthers. So each one of ours is precious. and we can't afford to be going 1-on-1 with these tanks, because 1-on-1 is a bit of a crapshoot as to who's going to win, because we both
and if you just play the sacrifice game, you lose. If you're the Germans in this position, you have to have economy of force, which is something that Nazis weren't very good at thinking about economy of force at all.
Because for the last 4 years, they'd had absolute dominance in these areas. Well, sorry, not absolute dominance, but they'd had a lot of dominance in these areas whereby they could go out and kill a lot of things, and so it'd be 10-1, 6-1, whatever advantage they would have. But suddenly, it was down to a 1-to-1 fight, and they could not sustain that.
Yeah, also this is the trouble when you're losing a war, but the Germans, particularly for the big cats, and particularly the Tigers and Königstigers, they were elite crews to reduce it to the bare minimum, thousands of hours of experience and training that could not be replicated or reproduced or recovered in the war. So in many ways, the crews were even more precious than the tanks. Not that the Germans could ever think of human beings, not the Germans, I apologise, the Nazis could think of human beings as being important. But that was a major problem for them, what a crew of a Tiger in general, or a Königstiger in particular, represented was irreplaceable in 1944.
And look, the Germans actually took the attitude of, if they knew there were IS-2s in an area, rather than having their Tigers and Tiger 2s deployed there, they would actually redeploy them in order to put the Stugs and have other tanks, less valuable tanks, in those areas, because if they're better for defending against the breakthroughs.
Yeah, bad day for the Stug crew, though, isn't it? You've got a much smaller gun. You can't even traverse the damn thing. And,
but you are better from ambush. This is the whole point.
Well, yeah, it sounds like, there's these tanks over there that are way too tough for our good tanks. So you guys keep throwing yourselves at them until something breaks.
Get in a good ambush position, and when they break through, shoot them then. So that's why they redeployed the Tigers and the Tiger 2s to areas that they wanted to defend. Or,
as we said earlier, just always be in the heavy tank battalion.
But it was again. We were saying before that the Germans realised that where previously their tactic of, if they get within 1,000 metres of a tank, they're going to kill it. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, against the IS-2s, they're finding we can't, and so they had to change their tactics of saying, all right, can't go 1-on-1. We have to go 3-on-1 if we're going to do it, and we need to get around to the sides and at short range, so under 600 metres.
I just want to revisit that point, Rob, because on the internet, there are a great many people, let's call them people, who will go on an enormous length how amazing the Germans were, because, the Shermans never engaged a big cat with less than 5 tanks, ignoring the fact that a Sherman platoon was 5 tanks and they just never deployed them in
singles.
They go on and on, and yet you're telling me that the Germans, when faced with the IS-2, came up with exactly the same solution. Does that mean the IS-2 is better than the German tanks?
They're different. They carried out different roles, and they had different supports. Which is, as I'm saying, it shows that the IS-2s carried only 8 rounds of AP versus 20 rounds of HE.
They need 4 minutes to fire those 8 rounds, going as fast as they can.
They only need one.
And you only need to hit the enemy once, yeah.
That's right. All right, so the Russians figured out they could, on the side of a Panther, they could kill it from 3,500 metres, so it's a long way, or 1,500 metres on the turret, and even the Tiger 2, they could kill it or disable it from 1,000 metres on the turret. So that's not a bad engagement for things against these great big German cats that have been dominating the battlefield for the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Now, Rob, we've been recording now for nearly 44 minutes, and we haven't touched the beer yet. So I'm going to suggest we just pause for a moment, come back with a beer review, and then we'll talk about the combat record.
Lovely.
Okay. Okay, Rob. Now,
did I get a Russian beer, John?
Well, I think first of all, it's time to tell people that it's time for
Beer review.
This ain't no grog or ale. 1 pint down, you'll be swinging in the gale. 5 pints, buddy, you'll be shaking in your shoes.
Yes, and a lot of people have been very concerned about what beer you would get us this week, Rob, or this month.
And
is it a Russian beer?
No.
No.
It's a German beer. It's a different German beer. But just remember, the East Germans did have IS2s.
This is from...
And they didn't get theirs taken off them by the Russians.
No.
They got to keep theirs, whereas the Hungarians, the Czechs did not.
I mean, the East German army was basically the rebirth of the Prussian military, but yes.
But the point is, they got to keep their IS2s and use them through to the 70s.
Yes, okay, and this is a Bavarian beer. This is the Camber, so it's a brewery in Bayern, which is in Bavaria. On their website, they say they have plenty of Bavarian tradition, which suggests not an excessive amount.
No,
but an adequate amount.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
They wear the lederhosen, but they don't yodel. I don't know if that's actually true or if I'm just stereotyping.
Yeah, so I think it was Chapo Trap House was pointing out that the pictures of Hitler in his lederhosen suggested he wasn't very comfortable in lederhosen. He didn't look happy. Okay, now this is what we are drinking is the Hop Gun Dry Hop Brown Ale.
And it is very brown.
It's very brown, and I would say it is also murky.
Yep.
This is a murky beer.
Yeah, no, you're not seeing through the other side of it.
Yeah,
there's a lot of brown there.
Murky isn't bad. Most of the beer I make is murky, so I'm not being too critical, but it's just an observation. Now, let's have a taste.
It's quite tasty, to my mind. It's got full of flavour. I don't know if there's any feijoa and durian fruit in it like yours, but...
Now, in brewing terms, so dry hopping, folks, is when normally in a traditional beer style, you would add the hops, which is where the bitter flavours come from, during the boil phase at some point. And sometimes you can add it before it comes to a boil, and sometimes you add it after you've turned the flames out. But that's the normal point for adding hops. And then in part of the New World American-style craft beers, there's a dry hopping process where you just throw enormous quantities of hops. It's really bad for the environment, actually, into the beer while it's fermenting, often a few days into the ferment once it's done the vigorous stuff, so it's not outgassing it and blowing it into the atmosphere. And that's where quite a lot of delicate flavours from the hop that you otherwise wouldn't get if it was in the boil can come out just by sitting in room temperature beer while it's fermenting. Or even, I think some dry hopping regimes include adding it really, really late just before you can it. So it's, but there's a problem for that in that it doesn't travel very well. If you put it in a can and leave it on a loading dock in summer, and then put it in a liquor store warehouse for another 6 months and then finally sell it with no refrigeration, a lot of those dry hop flavours don't last very well if they're not properly cared and stored for and kept cool. Now, I've got to say, this has those flavours. It's been made in Germany. It's somehow got here to Australia. I would suspect it had to have refrigerated storage, so well done for the importer who has managed that. Good work.
It's a 6.4% volume alcohol, so it's a 330ml bottle, and so it's 1.7 standard drinks. It's a very flavourful brown. I don't think I've had a dry hop brown ale before, which is why it caught my eye. I said, "Oh, yeah, that'll do."
Yeah. Now explain to the listeners again why the Russian beer is a Bavarian American style craft beer.
We don't get a lot of Russian beers in Canberra, and wherever they are, I can't find them because I don't look all that hard. There's about 3 bottle-os that I'll frequent, and that have various imported stuff within them. And I had a look. There was no Russian beers there.
Now, I've got to say that the Russians...
I did think about getting a Chinese, but I think we've already done Tsingtao or whatever it is. Just maybe in another life.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, there's lots of other Chinese beers.
Yes, but we might save those for when we do a Chinese
German
tank
beers.
or a Chinese tank.
Yes. We also need to do an Indian tank sometime soon. But hello, India. We lots more Indians listen to this podcast than Russians. So
welcome along.
Yeah. I really like this. I think this is a really clever piece of beer making, and they've mixed a few styles that aren't normally mixed together. So it's got the maltiness of a brown ale, which is sort of a thickness and sugariness. I use that term really, really dangerously because sweetness is considered a fault in beer. But it's the non-fermentable sugars are definitely there, which is part of a brown ale. And then you've got the delicateness of the dry hop, the aroma, and the fruity flavours. Well done, the Camba Brewery, Camba, from Bayern, Munich. You've made a cracking beer, and I reckon I could actually drink quite a few of these.
I wouldn't probably want to have too many, just because it would have too strong a flavour if I had more than two, I think.
Yeah, I mean, with all floral craft beers, there comes a point where you just want a lager. I reckon I could do a few of these, though. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely got that perfumey floralness to it, which apparently craft beer drinkers like.
And I think this one, because it's supposed to be refrigerated, so I'm assuming you drink it cold, and that's what we're doing, because it's... it's not 40 degrees like we had 2 years ago. It is still quite warm on a spring day here in Canberra, and we're expecting a storm anytime soon, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Rob has a little insulated caddy that he brings the beers over on his bicycle with, and that's appreciated, that attention to detail.
Yeah, I know, and with ice blocks in there. Too.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah. I like my cold beer cold, and I like my warm beer cold as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this is a beer just, served cold like all modern beers with a cryo system on them. But I would happily walk into a bar and order one of those. Although a pint would be quite a lot.
I don't think it was cheap. I was buying some other stuff, so I didn't actually look. But
like I said, I am 99% sure that had to be cold shipped all the way across the world. So
it might have been up around $10 a bottle, so not cheap.
Now, it's worth noting, though, that once you get into that price range, and if someone has gone to the effort of cold shipping it all the way around the world, it's probably because it's quite a good beer. So that's kind of something to look for. More expensive definitely doesn't always mean better, but if it's import beer, and it's worth asking in your liquor store, that they might lie to you, but it's worth asking whether it's been cold shipped. And I do know, because I've been to beer conventions where I've talked to these people, that more and more beer import-exporters are investing in cold shipping capacity to get that quality improvement.
All right. I'm sure the IS2 tank crews would have loved to have had one of these on a
no part of our modern life an IS2 crew wouldn't have happily taken.
As they were rolling through Bavaria. I didn't
think they got to Bavaria.
No, they probably didn't get to Bavaria, but we're going to go back to the IS2.
East Prussia was the best a Russian tank crew got to see.
Now, one of the faults I want to, again, for the developments, and I won't say this, the IS2 wasn't always perfect. One of the faults it did have is the first lot had rather than having a fully sloped front glasses, the hull. The driver's port was a great big shot trap square of armour that would be open, and the Russians quickly found that after losing about 11 of these things in one engagement, found that all the rounds had gone straight through the driver's vision slit, and because it was a flat surface rather than a sloped surface. You never want
to give the German gunners an opportunity, do you?
No, and so it was a flat surface, so they quickly realised, okay, we need to make the changes, which is where they've come in, and they said, right, driver, you've got a sloped all the front of the armour rather than having the shot trap of the driver's vision slit, and he said no, change that to a sloped armour, and again that proved the survivability of the tank hugely by realising what was happening and making the changes, and so away they went.
Now let's start going through some of the battles that this tank had. So in
So February 44 saw its first action after it had rolled out of production in December 43.
Yeah, so in the Ukraine at Korsun-Chevchenkovsky.
Yeah. Again, we've got to take a bit of a grain of salt of the results of these battles because they will have been written by the Russian tank commanders or the Russian command through these things. But from the sounds of it, it sounded like a battalion of 10 tanks were claiming to have killed 41 Tigers and Ferdinands through April 44.
So it's the 72nd Regiment.
Yeah, it's the one.
10 IS2s.
Yep.
So they lost 8, which is meaning they had 2 tanks left at the end of it. But to destroy, if they were anywhere near correct, 41 Tigers and Ferdinands in the process, because the Russians only needed, they only needed to destroy 1 German tank for every 2 tanks they had. To be destroying 4 German super heavies for the loss of each of their tanks is a significant achievement and war winning. Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is within Operation Bagration in August 44, again, as the Russians are advancing, there was one situation where what were the numbers again? It was about 50 Russian tanks versus 140 German tanks.
Is that the August 44? Yep.
And again, the IS-2s and even the T-34-85s with their mobility getting around the side, just because they were on the offensive, were made such a big difference and took out a huge number of Tiger 2s and Tigers, Panthers and Jag Tigers. Again, plenty of IS-2s got killed in that battle, but they still took on a vastly superior number of German tanks, German big cats, and took them out.
Now, the IS-2 was pretty much the point of the spear for Operation Bagration, which is kind of why the IS-2 is a slightly weird tank to talk about because it wasn't in service for an enormous amount of time. It was just incredibly important at an incredibly important moment. But
from May 44 to May 45, it was doing the work. It was the Germans at this stage had said, right, we're on the defensive. We got to bleed everything dry. Any sort of the Tigers were set up in defensive positions. They were no longer being just used as tank on tank killers. The Germans had set themselves up, and they're really good at defensive works, as shown by World War One. And so to be able to make these breakthroughs and carry and make these kills on these big cats is really impressive for the IS-2.
I've just got the numbers here. The Sandomierz bridgehead on August 13, 1944, which lasted until the 31st. The Russians in fortified positions claimed 4 Tiger 2s, that's the Koenigs Tigers, the King Tigers.
And 7
damaged. 3 Panzers and a Jag Tiger SPG, sorry. So the Jag Tiger self-propelled gun. It was, this was stuff that they never dreamed of seeing on the Western Front. That kind of concentration of heavy armour. There might be 1 or 2 Tigers in an engagement with American or British forces on the Western Front, and huge numbers getting monstered. The IS-2 didn't win every battle it was in. Sometimes it had bad results when battles went badly. It wasn't a miracle tank, but it was entirely competitive and often superior to the German super heavies, which is a big achievement.
Especially for a tank that's 20 tons lighter and just as fast and has a bigger gun.
And as we've said before, and we'll say ad nauseum, a lighter tank can cross more bridges and cross muddy ground. The IS-2 did start hitting trouble, particularly in warmer weather where the ground wasn't frozen, and getting into the Baltic countries with being able to traverse wet muddy ground. It tended to sink in like all heavy tanks do. But just astonishing some of the big things it took.
So once the Russians did reach Berlin, we had a lot of IS-2s were deployed there, just because building-to-building fighting through the city was they were very effective at that because they were protected from very well protected from any head-on engagements, and the HE rounds, as you were saying before, didn't have to aim up top levels of building. Not that Berlin was a terribly tall city, but mainly that one HE round going into a building was going to destroy everything inside of it. So they could clear out everything else. So they changed their doctrine to deploy them in company sizes of 5 tanks and have a company of sappers or assault engineers to go with them, and they would go clearing block by block by block as they went through Berlin. They were very effective at that. But however, they did lose plenty. They lost 67 IS2s, mainly to Panzerfaust, because again, firing from ambush into the sides or rear of these things was where you'd be able to take them out, and you can't see where they're coming from, so you can't.
Yeah. So the Panzerfaust was basically like a bazooka weapon that the Germans deployed later in the war, and with great effect. Lots of Hitler Youth sent out with the Panzerfaust told to get themselves a tank. I just want to note as well, in Hungary at Debrecen, I think it's pronounced, the 78th Regiment claimed to have destroyed 6 Tigers, 30 Panthers, 10 Panzer IVs, 24 self-propelled guns, as well as the defensive positions in the process, which is a lot.
That is.
Yeah, and of course, the IS-2 was absolutely decisive in the battle for Berlin.
Yep. Yeah.
As you were saying, just knocking down buildings that were proving troublesome.
Yeah. Now, after the IS-3 was getting rolled out at this stage of the war as well, but didn't really make it into service and rolling through Berlin for the end of the war in Europe. But as I was saying, the IS-2 did continue afterwards, and having been given out to first the Chinese, because the Russians wanted to include the international revolution of communism, giving out to a number of different countries, and from the Chinese, from the ones that they were given, they deployed a number of them to North Korea to repel when the Americans had done their breakthrough and were driving the North Korean army right back, and then suddenly however many millions of Chinese came rolling over the border saying, "Oh, we're volunteers," and they brought a couple of IS-2s with them in those engagements. I didn't get any good numbers on how they went in those conflicts.
That's a really murky affair, and again, all our sources are written entirely from one side.
Yeah, and it was a bit of contradictory information going on in that.
But I'm not meaning to rag on Americans here, but the longest retreat in the history of the US Army was down the Korean Peninsula, and
twice.
Well, the big retreat was after the Chinese intervened. And having said that, also a magnificently conducted fighting retreat, not to
especially
the
defensive actions by the Australians.
The Australian, 3rd Royal Australian Regiment did distinguish itself, as did the British Gloucesters. But it was also because there had been a tremendous miscalculation to trigger the Chinese intervention. So. Yeah, shame about that.
All right, so they also got given... so some of these IS-2s that were given to China were also handed over to the Viet Minh when they were fighting the French in Vietnam.
I just love the idea of an IS-2 rumbling around. Now, I've spent a bit of time in the north of Vietnam, and because I crossed from the border with China and then had to get a taxi all the way to Hanoi, which I can tell you was not a cheap endeavour. So I'm not saying I'm some sort of North Vietnam expert, but I have actually been there and seen the terrain, and not natural tank country.
No, not with the lack of roads and boggy and hills and boggy areas and jungle areas. But look, no, there's supposedly, and again, contradictory information around the place, but supposedly the Chinese did give the Vietnamese an IS-2 or two. to help against the French.
I mean, in terms of trundling up to where the bunker is and blatting it, I mean, yeah, it's good.
Yeah. And the French, in counterpoint to it, supposedly shipped a captured Panther tank from France over to Vietnam in order to take out the IS-2s. And
we haven't done the Panther yet. It's sort of a treat we're saving ourselves.
Oh yes, there's a lot of tanks, John. We don't want to blow them all up at the first.
But
in the first 2 years.
One thing you can say about the Panther is that it probably has, outside of the British Covenanter, the worst record for reliability of any tank that's entered major production.
But many other good stats that everybody loves it.
Yeah, but the idea of taking an old Panther from Germany and shipping it all the way around the world to Vietnam, far, far away from its supply lines, and putting it up in the jungle against a tank that overmatched it in 1943.
So we're talking 54 here, or probably 51 to 54 is where we're looking at these.
Sure. I'm just saying I'd rather be in the IS2.
Quite possibly. Depends on who could actually supply the parts, because, again, one of the issues with the IS-2s being shipped around to various communist countries was the Russians, having shipped them off, didn't actually provide a lot of spare parts for them, which is a bit annoying for
the
anybody.
Russians didn't really have a spare parts doctrine. It was just build another tank and send it out there.
Yeah, so, again, the information around this, the historical accuracy of this situation is not fully known from what I could find, but supposedly it happened. I'd love to hear if anybody's got any more information about it.
Yeah, I just love the idea of a final duel between the Panther and the IS-2 in the Vietnamese jungle.
Dien Bien Phu.
As you pointed out to me off mic, it's worth noting that a great number of the French forces in Vietnam at this stage were German Foreign Legionnaires. So, they might well have some Panther crews itching to get their hands back on what they were used to.
And the other one, where it wasn't actually used in combat, but it was almost... so in 1960, the Russians shipped 41 IS-2s to Cuba just before the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Castro had them all set up ready for the Bay of Pigs. They were just down the road in the Australia Sugar Refinery Factory, supposedly it was called. Yeah, I know. So I thought, I read that and I said, we have a sugar refinery there anyway. But yes, so he had his IS-2s ready to go, and if just in case the Bay of Pigs invasion by the US
had
gone slightly better, he was ready to roll about.
He was ready to make it go worse, even worse than it did.
They didn't end up needing them, so there you go. Again, the lack of spare parts meant the Cubans couldn't actually do a lot with them, so that's probably why they didn't end up in Angola or other places. But realistically, the export market was taken over very quickly by the T-55, so that's why not a lot of places. Which is why a lot of places did not get them. Russia didn't export them; they didn't sell them as much, but they just gave out them what they had left lying around the place.
Unless you need to fight German super heavy tanks, the IS-2 is not
breaking through heavy lines and bunkers and blowing stuff
trying
up.
to blast through the Silo Heights. You don't have a lot of use for something like the IS-2, but for the purpose it was created, it was absolutely a brilliant design. And
we've always heard about how poorly the crew comfort of the Russian tanks are, and the IS-2, having 3 people in the turret, was still having a huge gun in the turret, still had the most room in the turret for the crew, and it was actually one of the most comfortable tanks.
They had done away with turret elevation completely, so I guess that helped.
So it's comfortable. Of the Russian tanks, it's the most comfortable Russian tanks to be in. And as you say, if you're going to be in a tank brigade, be in a Guards brigade.
Yeah. Russians do not prioritise ergonomics or crew comfort. That's not part of their doctrine. Ditto spare parts and maintenance. And a lot of the Russian tank loss numbers are probably simply down to the fact that they didn't bother repairing tanks that were damaged
Yeah,
because there's just another tank coming up from the factory anyway.
That's right. They had a lower requirement for recovery than the Allies or even the Germans, who would say, "Yep, this tank's fine. All we need to do is X, and we'll get it back up and running." Whereas the Russians said, "We can't be bothered doing that. We're just going to keep on going."
Yeah. It's part of why it's hard to compare apples and oranges with these beasts. But anyway, we are well over an hour now, Rob. So I think aside from reminding everyone that we would really like it if you could give us 5-star reviews, so that more people can know about us. We're not asking you for any money. We're not begging you to join a Patreon. We just want some reviews, folks. Thank you very much for listening this far through, and we will be back next month with... We're going to have to go a modern tank, aren't we? We haven't done one in a while.
Well, who knows? It'll be a surprise for everybody.
Okay. All right. Catch you later, folks.
Take care and stay safe. Get vaccinated.